Hello, mere mortals, and welcome to a special episode of FanCastic. We are doing our first fun casting instead of fan casting. There will be one fun casting every month, 3 fan castings every month to kind of break up different things and make it exciting. So today that you're listening or watching is St. Patrick's Day. Happy St. Patrick's Day. So we're going to fun cast a fairy tale from a book that I picked up when I was in Galway this last October 2024. It was November by the time we got there. For our honeymoon, my husband and I went to London, Edinburgh, and Dublin. When we were in Ireland, we went to Dublin, we went to Cliffs of Moher, we went to Galway, we went to Belfast. So we went lots of places. It was very exciting. And while I was there, I'm a bookish girl, so I picked up this book, Irish Gothic Fairy Stories from 32 Counties of Ireland, illustrated by Steve Lally and James Patrick Ryan. These are a bunch of stories that are known and told in Ireland. The Irish are very superstitious and skeptical of fairies and fae and lore. They don't want to fuck with the fairies because they know that fairies will fuck with them. So a lot of these stories are about the background of that and the history. And there's one in particular that's actually the last story in the book that I really loved that has a fairy king, a fairy queen. It's got giants, it's got magic, it's got spells. So I thought for St. Patrick's Day, I would read you the story. I am a narrator, so I will read you the story for a story hour. And then I'm just going to share with you who I would cast if this was ever made into anything. So a fun casting. Let's read the story. Okay, here we go. This is harder than I thought. Pinkeen and the Fairy Tree of Doros. In the side of Bulbin is a white square in the limestone. It is said to be the door of fairyland. There is no more inaccessible place in existence than this white square door. No human has ever gone near it. Not even the mountain goats can browse beside its mysterious whiteness. Tradition says that it swings open at nightfall and lets pour through an unearthly troop of hurrying spirits. The forest of Doros was in the district of High Fiera. On a certain occasion, the Dedanans clan, the fairy folk, returning from a hurling match, passed through the forest carrying with them for food during the journey crimson nuts, apples, and scarlet quickenberries, which they had brought from the land of promise. One of the quickenberries dropped to the earth, and the Dedanans passed on. From this berry, a great quicken tree sprang up. Its berries have the taste of honey, and those who ate of them felt a cheerful glow, as if they had drunk wine or old mead. If a man were even 100 years old, he returned to the age of 30 as soon as he had eaten 3 of the quickenberries. The Dedanans heard of this tree, and not wishing that anyone should eat the berries but themselves, sent a giant of their own people to guard it. Once upon a time, the fairies of the West were going home from a hurling match with the fairies of the lakes rested in Doros Wood. For 3 days and 3 nights, they spent the days feasting and the nights dancing in the light of the moon. And they danced so hard that they wore the shoes off their feet. And for a whole week after, the leprechauns, the fairies' shoemakers, were working night and day making new ones. And the rip, rap, tap, tap of their little hammers were heard all in the hedgerows. The food on which the fairies feasted were little red berries, and were so like those that grow on the rowan tree that if you only looked at them, you might mistake one for the other. But the fairy berries grow only in fairyland, and are sweeter than any fruit that grows here in this world. And if an old man, bent and gray, ate one of them, he became young and active and strong again. And if an old woman, withered and wrinkled, ate one of them, she became young and bright and fair. And if a little maiden, who was not handsome, ate of them, she became lovelier than the flower of beauty. The fairies guarded the berries as carefully as a miser guards his gold, and whenever they were about to leave fairyland, they had to promise in the presence of the king and queen that they would not give a single berry to a mortal man, nor allow one to fall upon the earth. For if a single berry fell upon the earth, a slender tree of many branches bearing clusters of berries would at once spring up, and mortal men might eat of them. But it chanced that this time they were in Doros Wood, they kept up the feasting and dancing so long, and were so full of joy because of their victory over the lake fairies, that one little weeny fairy, not much bigger than my finger, lost his head and dropped a berry in the wood. When the feast was ended, the fairies went back to fairyland and were at home for more than a week before they knew of the little fellow's fault, and this is how they came to know of it. A great wedding was about to come off, and the queen of the fairies sent 6 of her pages to Doros Wood to catch 50 butterflies with golden spots on their purple wings, and 50 white without a speck or spot, to make a dress for herself, and 100 white without a speck of spot to make a dress for the bride and bridesmaids. When the pages came near the wood, they heard the most wonderful music, and the sky above them became quite dark, as if a cloud had shut out the sun. They looked up and saw that the cloud was formed of bees, who in a great swarm were flying towards the wood and humming as they flew. They were sore afraid until they saw the bees settling on a single tree, and looking closely at the tree, they saw it was covered with fairy berries. The bees took no notice of the fairies, and so they were no longer afraid, and they hunted the butterflies until they had captured the full number of various colors. Then, when they returned to fairyland and they told the queen about the bees and the berries, the queen told the king. The king was very angry, and he sent his heralds to the 4 corners of fairyland to summon all his subjects to his presence, that he might find without delay who was the culprit. They all came except the little weeny fellow who dropped the berry. And of course, everyone said that it was fear that kept him away, and that he must be guilty. The heralds were at once sent in search of him, and after a while they found him hiding in a cluster of ferns, and brought him before the king. The poor little fellow was so frightened that at first he could scarcely speak a word, but after a time he told how he never missed the berry until he had returned to fairyland, and that he was afraid to say anything to anyone about it. The king, who would hear of no excuse, sentenced the little culprit to be banished into the land of giants beyond the mountains, to stay there forever and a day unless he could find a giant willing to go to Doros Wood and guard the new fairy tree. When the king had pronounced sentence, everyone was very sorry, because the little fellow was a favorite with them all. No fairy harper upon his harp, or piper upon his pipe, or fiddler upon his fiddle could play half so sweetly as he could play upon an ivy leaf. And when they remembered all the pleasant moonlit nights on which they had danced to his music, and thought that they should never hear or dance to it any more, their little hearts were filled with sorrow. The queen was as sad as any of her subjects, but the king's word should be obeyed. When the time came for the little fellow to set out into exile, the queen sent her head page with him, with a handful of berries. These, the queen said, he was to offer to the giants, and say at the same time that the giant who was willing to guard the tree could feast on the berries just as sweet from morn till night. As the little fellow went on his way, nearly all the fairies followed him to the borders of the land, and when they saw him go up the mountain towards the land of the giants, they all took off their little red caps and waved them until he was out of sight. On he went, walking all day and all night. When the sun rose on the morrow, he was on top of the mountain, and he could see the land of the giants in the valley stretched far below him. Before beginning his descent, he turned around for the last glimpse of fairyland. But he could see nothing, for a thick, dark cloud shut it out from view. He was very sad and very tired and footsore, and as he struggled down the rough mountainside, He could not help of thinking of the soft green woods and the mossy pathways of the pleasant land he had just left behind him. When he awoke, the ground was trembling, and a voice that sounded like thunder fell on his ears. He looked up and saw coming towards him a terrible giant. With one eye that burned like live coal in the middle of his forehead, his mouth stretched out from ear to ear, his teeth were long and crooked, the skin of his face was black as night, and his arms and chest were all covered with black, shaggy hair. Round his body was an iron band, and hanging from this by a chain was a great club with iron spikes. With one blow of his club he would break a rock into splinters, and fire could not burn him, and water could not drown him, and weapons would not wound him. And there was no way to kill him but by giving him 3 blows of his own club, and he was so bad-tempered that the other giants called him Sharvan the Surly. When the giant spied the red cap of the little fairy, he gave the shout that sounded like thunder. The poor fairy was shaking from head to foot.
"What brought you here?"
said the giant. "Please, Mr. Giant," said the fairy. "The king of the fairies banished me here, and I must stay forever and a day unless you come and guard the fairy tree in the Doros wood."
"Unless what?"
roared the giant. And he gave the fairy a touch of his foot that sent the little fellow rolling down head over heels. The poor fairy lay as if he were dead, and then the giant, feeling sorry for what he had done, took him up gently between his finger and thumb.
"Don't be frightened, little man,"
said he.
"And now, tell me about the tree."
"It is the tree of the fairy berry that grows in the woods of Doros," said the fairy, "and I have some berries with me."
"Oh, you have you?"
said the giant.
"Let me see them."
The fairy took 3 berries from the pocket of his little green coat and gave them to the giant. The giant looked at them for a second. He then swallowed the 3 together, and when he had done so, he felt so happy that he began to shout and dance for joy.
"More, you little thief," he said. "More, you little—" "What's your name?"
said the giant. "Pinkeen, please, Mr. Giant," said the fairy, as he gave up all the berries. The giant shouted louder than before, and his shouts were heard by all other giants, who came running towards him. When Sharvan saw them coming, he picked up Pinkeen and put him in his pocket, that they shouldn't see him.
"What were you shouting for?"
said the giants.
"Because," said Sharvan, "that rock there fell down on my big toe." "You did not shout like a man that was hurt," they said. "What is it to you, what way I shouted?" said he. "You might give a civil answer to a civil question," said they. "But sure, you are always Sharvan the Surly."
And they went away. When the giants were out of sight, Sharvan took Pinkeen out of his pocket.
"Some more berries, you little thief. I mean, little Pinkeen,"
said he. "I have not any more," said Pinkeen, "but if you will guard the tree in the Doros wood, you can feast on them from morn till night."
"I'll guard every tree in the wood if I may do that,"
said the giant. "You'll have to guard only one," said Pinkeen.
"How am I to get to it?" said Sharvan.
"You must first come with me towards the fairyland," said the fairy.
"Very well," said Sharvan. "Let us go."
And he took up the fairy and put him into his wallet.
Pause. Why does a giant have a wallet? Living for this.
Before long, they were on top of the mountain. Then the giant looked towards the giant's land, but a black cloud shadowed out from view. While the sun was shining on the valley that lay before him, he could see away in the distance the green woods and shining waters of fairyland. It was not long until he reached its borders, but when he tried to cross them, his feet stuck into the ground, and he could not move a step. Sharvan gave 3 loud shouts that were heard all over fairyland, and made the trees in the woods tremble, as if the wind from a storm were sweeping over them. Please, Mr. Giant, let me out, said Pinkeen. Charvan took out the little fellow, who, as he saw he was on the borders of fairyland, ran as fast as his little legs could carry him, and before he had gone very far, he had met all the little fairies, who, hearing the shouts of the giant, came trooping out from the ferns to see what was the matter. Pinkeen told them it was the giant who was to guard the tree, shouting because he was stuck fast on the borders, and they need to have no fear of him. The fairies were so delighted to have Pinkeen back again that they took him up on their shoulders and carried him to the king's palace, and all the harpers and pipers and fiddlers marched before him, playing the most incredible music that was ever heard. The king and queen were on the lawn in front of the palace when the procession came up and halted before them. The queen's eyes glistened with pleasure when she saw the little favorite, and the king was so glad at heart. But he looked very grave as he said,
"Why have you returned?"
Then Pinkeen told his majesty that he had brought with him a giant who was willing to guard the fairy tree.
"And who is he, and where is he?"
asked the king. The other giants called him Charvan the Surly, said Pinkeen, and he is stuck outside of the borders of fairyland.
"It is well," said the king. "You are pardoned."
When the fairies heard this, they tossed their little red caps in the air and cheered so loudly that a bee who was clinging to a rosebud fell senseless to the ground. That poor bee. Fuck. Sorry. When the fairies... Okay. Then the king ordered one of his pages to take a handful of berries and to go to Charvan and show him the way to the Doros wood. The page, taking the berries with him, went off to Charvan, whose roaring nearly frightened the poor little fellow to death. But as soon as the giant tasted the berries, he got into good humor, and he asked the page if he could remove the spell of enchantment from him. "I can," said the page, "and I will, if you promise me that you will not try to cross the borders of fairyland."
"I promise that, with all my heart," said the giant. "But hurry on, my little man, for there are pins and needles in my legs."
The page plucked a cowslip, and the spell was broken, and the giant's limbs were free. Then Charvan and the fairy page set off for Doros woods, and it was not long until they came within view of the fairy tree. When Charvan saw the berries glistening in the sun, he gave a shout so loud and strong that the wind of it blew the little fairy back to fairyland. But he had to return to the wood to tell the giant that he was to stay all day at the foot of the tree, ready to do battle with anyone who might come steal the berries.
"All right,"
said the giant, who could barely speak as his mouth was full of berries. Narrating is so fun. Well, the fame of the fairy tree spread far and wide, and every day some adventurer came to try to see if he could carry away some of the berries. But the giant, true to his word, was always on the watch, and not a single day passed on which he did not fight and slay a daring champion. And the giant never received a wound, for fire could not burn him, nor water drown him, nor weapon wound him. Now, at this time, when Charvan was keeping watch and ward over the tree, a cruel king was reigning over the lands that looked towards the rising sun. He had slain the rightful king by foul means, and his subjects, loving their murdered sovereign, hated the usurper. But much as they hated him, they feared him more, for he was brave and masterful, and he was armed with a helmet and shield which no weapon made by mortal hands could pierce. And he carried always with him 2 javelins that never missed their mark, and were so fatal that they were called the shafts of death. The murdered king had 2 children, a boy whose name was Niall, and a girl who was called Rosaline. But no rose that ever bloomed was half as sweet, or fresh, or fair as she. The new king was cruel and mean, and he sent the boy adrift on the sea in an open boat, hoping that the waves would swallow it. And he got an old witch to cast a spell of deformity over Rosaline, and under the spell her beauty faded, until at last she became so ugly and so wasted that scarcely anyone would speak to her. And shunned by everyone, she spent her days in the outhouses with the cattle, and every night she cried herself to sleep. Same. One day, when she was very lonely, a little robin came to pick the crumbs that had fallen about her feet. He appeared so tame that she offered him the bread from her hand, and when he took it, she cried with joy at finding that there was one living thing that did not shun her. So sorry. This poor bitch. After this, Robin came every day, and he sang so sweetly for her that she almost forgot her loneliness and misery. But once, while the robin was with her, the tyrant king's daughter, who was very beautiful, passed by with her maids of honor, and seeing Rosaline, the princess said, "Ugh, there is that horrid, ugly thing." The maids laughed and giggled, and said that they had never seen such a fright. Poor Rosaline felt as if her heart would break, and when the princess and her maids were out of sight, she almost cried her eyes out. When the robin saw her crying, he perched on her shoulder and rubbed his little head against her neck, and chirped softly in her ear. And Rosaline was comforted, for she felt she had at least one friend in the world, although it was a little robin. But the robin could do more for her than she could dream of. He heard the remark made by the princess, and saw how Rosaline's tears, and he knew now why she was shunned by everybody, and why she was so unhappy. And that very evening he flew off to Doros Wood and called on a cousin of his and told him about Rosaline. "And you would want some of the fairy berries, I suppose?" said his cousin, Robin of the Wood. "I do," said Rosaline's little friend. "Times have changed since you were here last. The tree is guarded now all day long by a surly giant. He sleeps in the branches during the day, and he breathes upon them and around them every morning, and his breath is poison to bird and bee. There is only one chance open, and if you try that, it may cost your life." "Then tell me what it is, for I would give 100 lives for Rosaline," said her own little robin. "Well," said the Robin of the Wood, "every day a champion comes to battle with the giant, and the giant, before he begins the fight, puts a branch of berries in the iron belt that's around his waist, so that when he feels tired or thirsty, he can refresh himself. And there is just a bear of a chance, while he is fighting, of picking one of the berries from the branch. But if his breath falls on you, it's certain death." Maybe he needs a Mentos sponsor. "I will take the chance," said Rosaline's robin. "Very well," said the other. And the two birds flew through the wood, until they came within sight of the fairy tree. The giant was lying stretched on the foot of it, eating the berries, but it was not long until a warrior came, who challenged him to battle. The giant jumped up, and plucking a branch from the tree, stuck it in his belt, and swinging his iron club above his head, strode towards the warrior, and the fight began. The robin perched on a tree behind the giant, and watched and waited for his chance. But it was a long time coming, for the berries were in front of the giant's belt. At last the giant, with one great blow, struck the warrior down, but as he did so, he stumbled and fell upon him, and before he had time to recover himself, the little robin darted towards him like a flash and picked off one of the berries, and then, as fast as his wings could carry him, he flew towards home. And on his way, he passed over a troop of warriors on snow-white steeds. All the horsemen except one bore silver helmets and shining mantles of green silk, fastened by brooches of red gold, but the chief, who rode at the head of the troop, wore a golden helmet, and his mantle was of yellow silk, and he looked by far the noblest of them all. When the robin had left the horsemen far behind him, he spied Rosaline sitting outside the palace gates, bemoaning her fate. The robin perched upon her shoulder, and almost before she knew he was there, he put the berry between her lips, and the taste was so delicious that Rosaline ate it at once. And that very moment the witch's withering spell passed away from her, and she became as lovely as the flower of beauty. Just then the warriors on the snow-white steeds came up, And the chief with the mantle of yellow silk and the gold helmet leapt from his horse, and bending his knee before her, said, "Fairest of fair maidens, you are surely the daughter of the king of these realms, even though you are without the palace gates, unattended, and wear not royal robes. I am the prince of the sunny valleys." "Daughter of a king I am," said Rosalie, "but not of the king who rules these realms." And saying this, she fled, leaving the prince wondering who she could be. The prince then orders his trumpeters to give notice of his presence outside of the palace, and in a few moments the new king and all his nobles came out to greet the prince and his warriors and give them welcome. That night a great feast was spread in the banquet hall, and the Prince of Sun Valleys sat by the king, and beside the prince sat a king's beautiful daughter. And then, in due order, sat the nobles of the court and the warriors who had come with the prince. And on the wall behind each noble and warrior his shield and helmet were suspended, flashing radiance through the room. During the feast, the prince spoke most graciously to the lovely lady at his side, but all the time he was thinking of the unknown beauty he had met outside the palace gates, and his heart longed for another glimpse of her. When the feast was ended, and the jeweled drinking cups had gone merrily around the table, the bards sang, to the accompaniment of harps, the courtship of the Lady Eimer. And as they pictured her radiant beauty outshining that all of her maidens, the prince thought that fair as the Lady Eimer was, there was still one fairer. When the feast ended, the king asked the prince what brought him to his realms. "I come to look for a bride," said the prince, "for it was foretold to me in my own country that here only I shall find the lady who is destined to share my throne. And fame reported that in your kingdom are to be the found and loveliest maidens in all the world. And I can well believe that," added the prince, "after what I have seen today." When the king's daughter heard this, she hung down her head and blushed like a rose, for, of course, she thought the prince was alluding only to herself, as she did not know that he had seen Rosaline, and she had not heard of the restoration of her beauty. Before another word could be spoken, a great noise and the clang of arms were heard outside the palace. The king and his guests started from their seats and drew their swords, and the bards raised a song of battle. Gotta have some mood music, I guess. But their voices were stilled and their hearts silenced when they saw at the threshold of the banquet hall a battle champion, whose face they recognized the features of their murdered king. "He's come back to claim his father's throne," said the chief bard. "Long live Niall! Long live Niall!" answered the others. The king, white with rage and amazement, turned to the chiefs and nobles of his court and cried out, "Is there none loyal enough to drive that intruder from the banquet hall?" But no one stirred, and no answer was given. The king rushed forward alone, but before he could reach the spot where Niall was standing, he was seized by a dozen chiefs and at once disarmed. During this scene, the king's daughter had fled, frightened, but Rosaline, attracted by the noise and hearing her brother's name and the cheers that greeted it, had entered the banquet hall unperceived by anyone. But when her presence was discovered, every eye was dazzled by her beauty. Niall looked at her for a second, wondering if the radiant maiden before him could be his little sister he had been separated from for so many years. In another second, she was clasped in his arms. Then the feast was spread again, and Niall told the story of his adventures. And when the Prince of the Sunny Valley asked for the hand of Rosaline, Niall told his lovely sister to speak for herself. With downcast eyes and smiling lips, she said, "Yes." And that very day, Rosaline became the prince's bride. In her happiness, she did not forget the little Robin, who was her friend in sorrow. She took him home with her to Sunny Valleys, and every day she fed him with her own hands, and every day he sang for her the sweetest songs that were ever heard in Lady's Bower. I don't know what that means. The end. And that's a live cold reading. Okay, with a little fun tidbits in there. Now let's cast this bitch. Here's what I've got. Okay, guys, and we're back. Ready to cast. Here we go. The fun casting of Irish Gothic Fairy Stories from 32 counties of Ireland. We're going to start off with the Fairy King and Fairy Queen. For the Fairy King, I have cast Seth Rogen. Vibes, I don't know, felt right. I felt like he would be like bored with everything. So Seth Rogen. And then Goop herself, as fixing famous people, Dominic and Chris would call her Gwyneth. Gwyneth Paltrow. Because what is she doing besides giving people dollars in court cases and saying, be well, and selling vagina candles? Not a lot. So be in this fairy story. Why not? Next up, we have our main character, Pinkeen. For obvious reasons, Ethan Slater, pre-Ariana Glow Up. So this is actually taken from his Spotify Christmas songs. I hate this man because he cheated on his wife and left his baby. I don't care how much I love Ariana Grande. I'm still very mad at this. And Pinkeen seems like a fucking idiot. So I have cast who I feel is a fucking idiot. Moving on. We have our giant, Charvan the Surly, as Shaq. I just happened to find this photo of him with a red vitamin in his hands that looks like his face, and it happens to go with the berry thing. First of all, love that. Second of all, the obvious choice is Shaq. He's a gentle giant. He's gonna guard your fucking fairy tree and beat the shit out of anybody who, like, tries to fuck with it. Obvious choices here. Okay. Then we have our Niall, the son of the murdered king, as we move into the later half of the story, which I know that story was really hard to follow. It is written in not full English. It was not great to read. It was very hard to cold read, so hopefully it made sense. But anyways, I'm going to cast this Gavin Casalegno, who is from The Summer I Turned Pretty. Feels right. He's described as having a straight, strong nose like his father. I don't know who would play his father. Somebody with piercing blue eyes, George Clooney. But I picked him because he looks like he could be the brother of Rosaline, who is Sabrina Carpenter. I would love to see Sabrina Carpenter look so fugly and then get to be Sabrina Carpenter because she is so pretty. And she's an actor and she's really funny and she does theater and camp. So I feel like she could do both. And like, she would be like, I'm friends with a Robin. Unfortunately, we didn't cast the voice of the Robin because there's too many people and I don't care. The Prince of Sun Valley would be Deacon Philippi, the son of Ryan Philippi and Reese Witherspoon. He just looks like he would be riding a white horse and would be like, I want the prettiest girl. I don't care if she's smart or has a history. She needs to be the prettiest. Feels like this is him. Then we have the murderous king is Adrian Brody, mostly because I'm pissed off of the fact that he made a crappy speech at the Oscars. It was so long and very rude. I understand he wants to win, and that's fantastic, and he won, and congratulations, use your time. But if you say, I'm going to wrap this up, and then you talk for 5 more minutes, I have problems with you, and I'm going to cast you as a murderous king. And his daughter, Lady Eimer, will be Tate McRae. I feel like they could pull off father-daughter, and I chose her because she can be snotty, but I actually really like her. So I thought she'd be fun because she's pretty too. And also 2 pop stars, love. And that's it. Okay? Here's my full cast. This is just a small story. It doesn't have to be a big deal. I think I nailed it. And there's no one here to fight me on it. This is why it's a fun cast. Thank you. Happy St. Patrick's Day. Goodbye.